debrief because we just kicked off our 26 FY26 FY26 to FY30 CIP. The budget team, the CATS budget team, held a kickoff meeting a week ago where we went through the details of assembling our budget going forward. What we put out to the group was, to keep service levels, some broad brush stroke things, because we're still waiting to hear about, hear from the city initiatives and things like that. We're still working. We still have sessions set up with the MTC, or we'll be scheduling sessions with the MTC to get their feedback on priorities and items like that. So we don't want to get too far ahead of any of those. But what we did tell the staff to begin preparing is a budget that really keeps service levels consistent with where they are now. If you can make some small incremental, adjustments based on some savings or based on some optimization of services, please look at that. But again, I think where we're heading with 26 and with the budget, the CIP budget 26 through 30 is kind of maintaining where we are now, keeping that going, beginning to set the course for what may happen, if the legislation is presented, the legislature authorizes the vote, and then the vote takes place and is, positive. This will be a budget that will start to bridge FY26 and FY27 into that, but we don't know how, we don't know how that's going to go a year from now, more than a year from now yet, but we are starting to plan for that. And so this budget really could be summed up as it's a little more than keep the lights on, but it's keep services where they are now, make incremental adjustments, and we'll be advising the MTC along the way. And if there are any questions at this time, I'm happy to address them or come back with clarifying answers.
I just checked. Is there plans for replacement of the buses in this next year's budget? Because my understanding is a lot of buses that are getting to their life.
So we've initiated over the past 2 years a pretty substantial replacement of both our I'll say simple terms. I'm a finance guy. Larger buses, and also really our STS, the paratransit fleet, the entire paratransit fleet should be turned over by this time next year is the goal, right? We're trying to get some new vehicles in here for those. With the larger vehicles, I believe we're under contract or in some form of delivery of about 60 new vehicles, 60 new buses of the larger type buses, and so that's ongoing. Now, whether ideally we would get into a cycle where we're replacing so many every year, and we're working toward that, whether we add substantially to that number of additional replacements, I will say we have a fleet plan that's directing that, but it comes down to resources. But we agree we need to be turning the fleet over, bringing the fleet back to, an average age that's reasonable, 12, 14 years, somewhere around there. And so that's what we're working toward.
Yeah, because I've just noticed recently that some of the express routes on 77 are now using local buses. Mr. Hill, service, it was my understanding is that there is an age of fleet there. That was why I was asking that.
So Mr. Howell, would you mind if I jump in here?
Please, Mr. Cameron.
So the over-the-road buses, we have 5 on order. We made that order approximately 2 months ago. And that will enable us to better ensure consistency on that side of the fleet. Clearly, our current operational desire is for the longer express routes, those that travel on interstates or freeways, to always be the larger over-the-road buses. We do prioritize our existing over-the-road fleet for those purposes, but there are occasions, it happens much less frequently, but it does happen. And there are occasions where a quote unquote local bus or a bus that's configured for local service um, can or does run one of those longer express routes. That's not sort of the operating directive, but on occasion it does happen. Once we get the 5 new MCIs, which are over the road buses, into the fleet, um, we should be able to have even better consistency on over the road buses being assigned to those specific routes like the 77X, the 63X, some of those routes that go out to Matthews and the east side. But that is the desire on the local fleet. As Mr. Howell said, we do have, we've made a pretty significant order, and we will continue ordering buses so that we bring the average age of the fleet down. One thing is we may slow down a little so that we don't continue to create sort of a large lump in the replacement cycle. Because of where we were a couple years ago, we did do that. 60, it may even be 70 buses are on order. They take about 2 years from the point of ordering to the point of being put in service. So we're trying to smooth out that replacement lump to the best we can on those local routes. And then on the on the STS fleet, about 85 vehicles. We have ordered approximately 60. They are here and they are going through make ready, and we will be evaluating sort of timing of final replacement on the remaining approximately 25 of those vehicles. So you should continue to see vehicle replacement as a priority in all the budgets. What we really want to do is get down to a normal replacement cycle so that we're really replacing approximately the same number of vehicles every year so that we don't have those spikes or lumps in the replacement cycle.
What about the electric vehicle pilot program that was in effect? Is that complete? And are we looking at buying electrical vehicles?
Yeah, so on the electric vehicles, you'll recall that for the pilot, we had 18 vehicles. We have also purchased approximately another 15 vehicles. I think it gets us to 30 or 35. I can get you the exact number total of electric vehicles in the fleet, along with the additional electric vehicles that we purchase, and all of the newly ordered electric vehicles are Gilligs. The initial 18 was a mix of Gillig and New Flyer, so we have gone with Gillig. Along with the additional vehicles, we also have ordered and will be installing additional charging infrastructure. At this point, we will continue to buy electrics as the technology progresses so that we can test new technology. But we're sort of hindered with our future purchases of electrics in 2 ways. One is just the range of the vehicles and how we can utilize them in the fleet, given the range of the vehicle and the charging time required on the vehicles. And 2 is just our availability of charging infrastructure. And so we do have a zero emission fleet transition plan that is completing. It's wrapping up right now. And we need to look at that and start to do planning, more long-term planning on, as we were really to be prepared as we transition the fleet. How are we prepared to charge that fleet and utilize that fleet given the requirements we have both in length of routes and the number of hours required in service daily? One of the problems on that, let me be more clear on that because that maybe doesn't make sense. You know, our buses, it usually takes around 6 hours to charge a bus if it's fully, if the batteries are fully depleted. Our buses, generally speaking, do not have 6 hours of downtime overnight between service days. And so we have to figure out how we have more charging available to be able to charge those buses overnight. And all of that takes charging infrastructure, and quite frankly, it takes a lot of space. And so we're looking at that now, but it is, you will see us purchasing far more electric hybrid vehicles in the near future as we figure out a plan for how to execute a transition of the fleet.
Yes, I'd like to turn to light rail for just a second here. The repairs on all the light rail vehicles involving the trucks, 15-year rebuilds for all the cars, how is that panning out? When is that all supposed to be completed?
It's going well. I can provide you, we can email out a better summary, but in general, it's going well. You'll recall that we have two different shops now with Siemens that are servicing our vehicles or our trucks. One is in Florida, where they are doing the bearing replacement. And then the other is their traditional shop in California, in Sacramento. The contract that we have with them to do all of the maintenance is through 2028. However, that's a little bit deceptive because as they're doing the maintenance, we realize that they will need to, those trucks will need to be serviced again. And so the 2028 number really reflects how do we maintain the trucks at least through 2028, 2029 timeframe. We anticipate right now, I believe we have, it's 9 vehicles or truck sets returned from service, and 7 are out being serviced. And we're prioritizing the 100 and 200 fleet vehicles, which are the oldest vehicles in the fleet. Once we have a sufficient number of the 100 and 200 vehicles back from service, we should be able to do 2 things. One, those vehicles will no longer be quote unquote grounded. They are currently grounded by NCDOT SSO. And so as they come back, we can put them back into service. And 2, that will enable us to have more vehicles to make daily service. And we can start to have conversations with NCDOT about lifting the other restrictions like the speed restriction from the fleet. And that will enable us to think about frequency and headways along the blue line.
And we're talking about the budget. One of the other things, obviously, we're going to focus on heavily is maintenance, continuing not only the progress that we've made, but also ensuring that we don't backslide on any of it. And I've in regular talks with our rail folks to make sure that they've got the resources they need in this year and planning for them next year to keep this great progress that they've made up.
Question. Yeah, as it relates to the budget.
Here.
A lot about equipment. Everyone had a couple questions about staffing and what's been allocated for staff. Your increases. Your pay increase. Service level.
Okay. Mr. Gregory, you want to take that or you want me to handle? He asked about staffing.
Yeah, can you repeat that question? It was kind of cutting out. It wasn't very clear.
On the one.
I think it was still a little too close to, yeah.
However, rephrase the question. Yeah, we talked a lot about equipment and I guess the question was about, from my perspective, was how are we doing from a budgetary standpoint with regard to staffing? Are we increasing the number of staff, increasing their compensation? And how is that level of compensation and staffing level impacting service levels? So it's kind of a two-part.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think you'll recall when I started about 2 years ago now, the total department vacancy rate for CATS was approximately in the 20 to 25% range. over the last 2 years, we have seen that vacancy rate cut in half. It is now down at about 10%. It goes up and down monthly, but it's around 10%. So we've cut it roughly in half. We did that through, what I'm going to call aggressive recruitment and retention efforts, looking at pay, looking at benefits, looking at those kinds of things. Now that we've stabilized the vacancy rate, we are starting to look at staffing, just total staffing numbers. Right now on the bus side, the bus operator is the same way. They had high vacancies when I started, and those vacancies are now being reduced. They have adequate staff to run the existing schedule, and on the bus side, and I would say that we have adequate staff to operate the rail side. We do have a few areas that we do specifically need to look at for additional staffing. They're very specific areas like the ROC, the Rail Operations Control Center. The vacancies have been reduced in the ROC, but it would be our preference to have more available staff in general. And so we are looking at that across the board so that we can look at targeted areas for total staffing increases. But I think on the pay and benefits side, we've done a good job of addressing that, and you can see that in the greatly reduced vacancy rate over the last 2 years.
And I would just add, of course, a budget is a plan. And as we put the plan for FY25 in place, we are monitoring now to see if there additional resources need to be added from a staffing standpoint. And we're looking at that. We have a group that meets regularly to look at that. Mr. Cagle talked about the ROC, right? That's one that came up that we needed to look at additional potential staffing there. But we're also looking at other areas too to make sure that we continue to provide levels of service that we've established.
Mr. Cagle, I have, sorry, go ahead. Was that Ms. Dunlap Thompson?
It is. Good morning. Mr. Cagle, I just wanted to ask a question. With the new managing company, National Express, being here on the ground in operation for the past couple of months, what is the level of satisfaction of the performance of the managing style thus far? Is there a preliminary report, an update that you can offer to the group? Are there any flags of any kind that has raised any concerns or what have you? I'd just like to get a little bit more of understanding of their first couple of months of performance.
Yeah, I'd say in general, and we're happy to provide more detail around this. In general, our satisfaction has been high with National Express. I believe that the staff and specifically the SMART union, who represents the vast majority of the TMOC, Transit Management of Charlotte staff, the operators and the mechanics, are seeing improvements. It is a process, right? I won't say that everything is perfect, but clearly we are moving in the right direction. I know that National Express as well as CATS have looked at certain things. What are those things where we can create quick wins? Things like operating procedures for the operators that help to deconflict their jobs with passengers. So we've made some of those changes. We also continue to work through. We're just kicking off our enhanced de-escalation training, and we continue to work through safety and security concerns to enhance our position on safety and security for operators and our passengers. So I think in general terms, it's going well, but clearly we'll continue to see improvements as National Express and the employees and specifically the union continue to work together to both enhance morale and the operator experience, which will in turn enhance the customer and passenger experience.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Cagle, I have one last question for you. Going back to the bus fleet, do you expect that it'll be another cycle of replacements before we're fully electric? Meaning that the way we're going right now, we'll have a mixture of electric fleet and hybrid electric once the final bus is replaced, and then the follow-on cycle would be where we transition fully to a fully electric fleet? Or do you believe that it's more or less just going to be ongoing until at some point we're going to be fully electric and no real cycle per se?
I think that we are at least one cycle from fully electric. Again, the issue is not in availability of buses or even cost of electric buses. It's really in charging and facilities needed to support the electric buses. And those facilities, those kinds of charging improvements and facility improvements they're much higher dollars, and they're a longer lead time. And so I think that it will be a very gradual progression. And I would expect that if you think about the fleet we have today, I would expect that all of the fleet today will be replaced before we start to really be able to think about full electrification of the fleet. The other thing I'll say is as we progress into the future, not in the next year, certainly, but over the next few years, the other thing that's unknown about this, all of this zero emission fleet transition, is what role will green hydrogen play in the future. There are some transit agencies that are piloting or utilizing green hydrogen. That is not an option for us today because of availability in this market for green hydrogen. But if and when, and we think it is a when, not an if, but when that changes, with Charlotte having better availability of green hydrogen, we may even start to look at green hydrogen as an option for zero emission fleet.
Thank you for that. And sorry, my question was a little unclear.
Oh.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions for either Mr. Cagle about that or Mr. Howell about the budget? Hearing none, I will move on to the next item, which is the CEO report. So Brent, whenever you want to take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So just wanted to, I know we've been on a little bit of a break, so wanted to give you some updates on operations and how we're doing. You may recall over the last couple years, we've been very focused when it comes to the bus fleet on missed trips. Again, you may recall that we sort of maxed out missed trips at about 10 or 11% of missed trips daily. That's a pretty high percentage for missed trips. Again, that was driven by vacancies in operators, in operator positions. I'm happy to report that over the last 4 or 5 months, it does appear that with the additional staffing, we've solved for missed trips. Missed trips have maintained at under 1%. So effectively zero is probably not, it's not reasonable to think that missed trips will literally be zero on a day-to-day basis. There are reasons why missed trips happen, but they should be very infrequent, and that's where we're at. And we have been maintaining that very low, effectively zero level of missed trips. Now, that being said, as we solved for missed trips, we started to really look at another very important operating metric, and that is on-time performance, or OTP. A general industry standard for OTP is about 85% on-time performance across all routes. So we were monitoring that, and over the last few months, what we found is our OTP was somewhere around 80%. So that's a little low for us, for a transit system. We need that to be at 85 or better. We have assembled a task force with our planning division, as well as with our bus operators. So our Transit Management of Charlotte group. And last month, our OTP was at 83%. So we're seeing it somewhere hovering in that 80 to 83%. We need to make improvements, and we are looking at strategies for how we do that. I will also say we are conducting what's called a runtime analysis. And a runtime analysis is really exactly what it sounds like, in that you do an analysis of the runtime of the routes. Because quite frankly, over time, some routes become very, very hard to maintain OTP. And that can be because of length of route and traffic or construction going on, or just changes in the nature of the route and the environment around the route. Most transit agencies look at runtime analysis periodically. I won't say there's a magic number, but let's call it every 5 years at least. What I found was CATS had not done a runtime analysis in a significantly longer amount of time than 5 years. So we are doing that now, and that will help us get a better handle on how we increase on-time performance, which also should help with customer satisfaction. I know sometimes, if you go out and talk to the passengers, they'll say, well, it all sounds good that your missed trips are under 0%, but hey, there was a missed trip, last week. And sometimes what happens is, from a customer, a missed trip and a significantly delayed bus can almost look the same. And we acknowledge that, even though these are metrics that we track separately to a customer, a missed trip and a very late or a very early bus can almost look the same. And so we are working through that. We do believe we have a handle on missed trips, but we are still working through on-time performance. So I wanted to make you aware of that as a priority. Also wanted to make you aware, and I see there's a comment in the chat, so I'll get to that comment as well with the next update. So a couple things have been going on over the summer. One, I'm happy to report that CATS is now the proud owner of the O-line, which is the Norfolk Southern, what we refer to. Norfolk Southern refers to it as the O-line. We refer to it as the Red Line. CATS and the city of Charlotte was able to successfully negotiate and close the purchase of the O-line from Norfolk Southern. That is the roughly 25-mile alignment that runs from uptown Charlotte up into the line, runs into Mooresville. We purchased all of the line to the Mecklenburg County border with Iredell County. We did not purchase any of the line in Iredell County, but we did negotiate an option for future use, for future purchase of the Red Line into Iredell County, but that would only happen with agreement and consent from Iredell County and Mooresville. So that option is still on the table, and we can exercise that in the future if Mooresville and Iredell County support that, but only with their consent and support of that would we do that. When it comes to project, executing the project, we have basically, in our speak, done corridor preservation, right? We've bought the corridor. We do not have financial capacity to build the line. or make the improvements to the line necessary to run commuter rail. What we will have to do is continue to monitor the progress of both the General Assembly's efforts to consider legislation that would enable the Mecklenburg County voters to go to referendum to consider a 1 cent sales tax increase. That 1 cent sales tax increase is both for roads and transit. First step is General Assembly. Second step are Mecklenburg County voters. And so for the red line for any of the projects in the 2030 system plan, as well as Better Bus, for CATS to be able to implement or execute those projects, we need the 1 cent sales tax, both to be authorized by the General Assembly and then approved in the form of a referendum by the voters. I will say on the sales tax efforts thus far, all of the towns except Matthews have passed resolutions in support of the General Assembly authorizing through legislation Mecklenburg County's ability to put the 1 cent sales tax increase in front of the voters. Mecklenburg County itself takes up the resolution for vote tonight. And so where we stand today is Mecklenburg County will vote tonight on that resolution. However, all of the towns, including Charlotte, have voted in favor of the resolution with the exception of Matthews, and Matthews does not support the resolution. Let me pause there for questions.
Why Matthews? Any insight into why Matthews has not gone along with the resolution?
Yeah, they've been pretty clear about it. The primary reason is the 1 cent sales tax is divided between roads and transit in a way that will mean that the funding for transit is not as high as initially anticipated. And that does mean that CATS and the MTC will need to go through an extensive process to update the transit system plan, commonly referred to as the 2030 plan. And the concern with that, while no decisions have been made, I want to be clear on that. The concern with that is that with less funding, there is the possibility that the Silver Line, which is the single largest project in the 2030 plan, may have to be reevaluated, and either the project will have to be, we would have to find cost savings in the current project by doing things like looking at different alignments or other things. It may not be feasible.
Hey, Mr. Cagle, sorry to interrupt, but can you backtrack about 30 seconds? You froze there, and we didn't hear some of what you said.
Yeah, sorry. I apologize. The main issue that Matthews has is around the Silver Line. There is a lot of discussion about the Silver Line. Fundamentally, the sales tax initiative that the legislature seems to support and that the towns support puts more money or an equal share of money towards roads as it does to transit. And that really means that as CATS moves forward, we will have to reevaluate all of our project costs to make sure that they are financially feasible. And clearly, the Silver Line is the largest project in the 2030 plan or the transit system plan. And that does mean that as we reevaluate that, we may have to consider changing the Silver Line project from light rail to possibly bus rapid transit. Now, I'll caution that decision has not been made. That is a process that we will launch with the MTC to evaluate and update the transit system plan to make it financially feasible. But clearly, the 2030 plan, as we've all envisioned it, the funding that's being proposed for transit in the current legislation is not sufficient to properly to entirely fund all of the transit system plan, the 2030 plan, as it sits today. It is not a fiscally constrained plan.
Thank you. Got it. Makes sense.
Mr. Cagle, can you address something for me that I've seen in the media? I think it's on the Charlotte Business Journal and maybe some other places. They're now saying that the cost of the total plan, I don't know how they got this number, is going to be upwards of $25 billion. Can you address that? Because that just doesn't seem right.
I need to look at that. I thought what the $25 billion was referring to was the revenues in total from the 1 cent sales tax. But that includes the road portion. But let us look at that, and we can send that out to the group. But I thought what the $25 billion was referring to really was the total revenues from 1 cent sales tax increase. But remember, 40% of that is dedicated to roads. It's not all
Okay,
dedicated.
that might be correct. The way I read the stories and maybe the headlines kind of primed me to read it this way was that the plan now costs $25 billion. And I think there's from chatter I've seen online, I think other people are under that impression too. So that might need to be addressed from a PR standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mr. Cagle, you've alluded in some of your addresses to City Council and other government bodies all during this process over the last several months that if the sales tax legislation is passed by the General Assembly, there would be sort of a 6-month community awareness period where there would be a discussion amongst the community as to the components of this plan and to perhaps revisit actually anything in there to make adjustments. Is that the case, or will the enactment of legislation trigger that, or is that going to happen regardless of whether the legislation is passed until next year?
Yeah, the legislation does not trigger that, but certainly the legislation and the possibility of a voter referendum in November of 2025 would lend urgency to that. So anytime that we're thinking about changes to the transit system plan, we seek community input, and then we make recommendations for consideration of the MTC, right? It is the MTC's purview to approve or not approve these projects. And so as we understand the funding levels that are available, and as we understand that those funding levels are not sufficient to support all of the different projects, then we need to go out and do a transit system plan update. And part of that is internal to staff, right? Running the numbers and looking at, are there cost savings on projects? Part of that is also going out to the community to understand what their priorities are. As we're starting to consider possible changes to the plan, we want those changes to be informed by community and what their priorities are, so that we can then put that package together for consideration of the MTC. What we would like to do is start that internal work soon, this calendar year in the winter, and then launch the community side of that next calendar year in the beginning of the year, hopefully to bring us to a position where the MTC can consider and approve an updated transit plan by roughly the summer of 2025. So let's call that June or July of 2025. And that puts us about, several months in advance of the possible voter referendum. We think that's important because we do understand the need of the voters to know what they're voting for, right? When asked to vote for a 1 cent sales tax increase, it's completely reasonable for a voter to know what they're voting for. And so that would be the process to bring the transit system plan into what we call fiscally constrained or a financially feasible state, and define those projects for the voters so that they know what they're voting for.
This Todd Stice, I assume that the folks that are involved in the highway end are doing a parallel effort so that they can know what to expect if they do pass it, what road improvements that they would get for their communities.
Yeah, so it's my understanding that that is correct, at least on the Charlotte side. I have to imagine that that is true for all of the towns as well. Because remember, the road portion will not just go all to Charlotte. It gets allotted to all of the towns, Charlotte included, on an allocation basis. And so Charlotte is certainly doing that, and I have to imagine that all of the towns are doing that.
All righty. Well, with that, do we have any more questions from the group for Mr. Cagle?
And I do have.
Oh, sorry.
I believe he has in.
I'm sorry about that. I thought you were finished.
No, I have
Apologies.
one more update. I'll make this one brief. I know we've used a lot of time. So I will make this one brief. The last update is you will all recall that the MTC embarked upon an effort to update or amend the interlocal agreement that governs the MTC. That process was ongoing throughout the last year. I am happy to report that all of the members, except Matthews, have approved the amended interlocal agreement. And at the August MTC meeting, the final approval was obtained, and that is approval from the MTC. Again, all members except Matthews approved the amended interlocal agreement. And so that agreement has now been ratified or approved by a sufficient number of members to make it, to have it pass. I bring that up. It does have many changes and clarifications in it, but I bring that up to this group just so that you are aware. One of the changes that it makes is it does create a new transit advisory group. It is called the PTAC. That group will be set up and ready to go. We anticipate in January of next year, but as a result of the creation of the PTAC, it also eliminates the TSAC and CTAG, or this group. So as we line out in September, we'll be working at the next MTC meeting. We'll be working with the MTC to establish a process for taking applications or letters of interest from interested parties who want to serve on the PTAC. But what it does not do is just automatically transfer existing members of CTAG and TSAC to the new group. It eliminates the two groups and then it creates a new group called PTAC. So I wanted you to be aware of that so that when we discuss that with MTC next week at their September meeting, it was not sort of coming out of the blue for you, for all of you as members of the CTAG.
And Mr. Chairman, I would add too that everybody got this digitally, but also at your for those that are here today, the PTAC is discussed starting on page 5 of the document, the amended interlocal agreement. And Ms. Coonsey, this went out with them too. So,
Yeah, I just
Yeah.
sent the link this morning.
yeah, so for those online, you have a link to it. For those here, you have a link and a hard copy. And I know, I don't believe we're here to go through it in detail, but as you start thinking through, as you follow up on what Mr. Cagle said, it is covered in some detail, starting on page 5.
Michelle Thompson Stack.
Yes, ma'am.
And I'm trying to hear you all clearly. I think I heard CTAG, and if so, can I get that acronym, please?
Oh, it's PTAC, Public Transit Advisory Committee, is the
Okay, thanks.
new subcommittee advisory group of the MTC. And it is outlined in detail on page 5 of the amended interlocal agreement that Mr. Cagle just covered at a very high level. And everyone was sent a digital copy of that, including all the signature pages this morning.
Yeah. But do remember, the important point is at the next MTC meeting, the ILA does not specify the process that needs to be used to appoint new members. So that is going to be the discussion we have with MTC next week at their September meeting, because we know there needs to be a process established that takes us through October, November, and December, so that the new PTAC group is populated with members and ready to go in January of 2025.
Thank you so much, and my apologies for not having and holding that knowledge. I'm always sort of on the road moving and trying to balance a lot of different things. The one thing, though, that I would just like to offer to bring to the table for potential consideration, if there are members of the CTAG group, I did hear CEO Cagle say that there is not an automatic placement, but I would ask that if anyone here that is currently serving, if there would be some type of process for a first consideration as you all are mapping out what that is going to look like. I think that would be advantageous for the group here, as well as the work that is moving forward, especially for those persons that have been sitting in meetings and had somewhat of an awareness and a background framework for the work that is up and forthcoming. So I would just want to name that and hope and ask that you all would consider that. I yield.
We can certainly share that with MTC. Ultimately, again, MTC we will be discussing with them how they would like to proceed on this, but certainly that's input that we can provide to them on behalf of CTAG.
Thank you. And then I also have one other question. With that transition, I know these appointments are 2-year appointments. So with this new committee that is going to be implemented, is that going to be taken in consideration as far as persons that have served those 2 terms, or would it be starting new? How would that process work?
So at the risk of jumping in and answering a legal question, I believe that an appointment to PTAC would be a standalone appointment that would not be influenced by previous service on TSAC or CTAG. It is a new independent group or separated. And I do not believe the ILA specifies that if you were previously on one of the other groups, that would affect your term limit, so to speak, on PTAC. But I'll follow up with the attorneys to verify that.
Please do. Thank you so much.
Have a question? Yep. Yeah, I think we've done some great work in terms of, I guess, stabilizing the system with regard to service level. And I still have the sort of follow-on question is, what's the plan for expansion of service levels? When do you see that happening? What metrics, will you be using to say we're okay to expand?
Yeah. So when it comes to expansion of service, the primary metric that we will look at, I mean, we always want to be effective and efficient in our operations, but when it comes to enhancing services, the primary metric is the budget, is financial feasibility. And quite frankly, when it comes to enhancing services, we need additional revenues before we're able to really start to implement a lot of the recommendations for service enhancement that are contained in the Better Bus project or program of projects, as well as the capital projects associated with the 2030 plan. So the primary metric on enhanced service is truly financial capacity.
And do we see that happening?
Not without new revenues, or only very slowly. I
So
think
when you
what we
say,
have. I'm sorry,
when
go
you say
ahead.
new revenues, I mean, please, what do you mean? Like, where would
Well,
those come from? Like, what are the options other than, I mean, if the sales tax is not does the sales tax contemplate increased service levels, or that's just expansion?
it does. It does. And so in the sales tax, 40% of the sales tax is dedicated to roads. 20%, well, let me back up. 40% is dedicated to roads. No, so that leaves 60% for transit. No more than 40% of that transit dollars can be dedicated to rail. How it's leaving at a minimum 20% for bus. But again, it's no more than 40% can be rail, but less than 40% could also be rail, right? And so it's a cap on rail, not a requirement of 40%. And so what we see is right now, we will continue to be limited in our ability to make service enhancements until we can secure a new funding source. The new sales tax, if it were to pass, just to put it in order of magnitude, on an annual basis at the minimum level, 20% for bus, would provide approximately $70 million of additional annual money to bus, which is a roughly 50% increase in our bus spending levels of today. But today, Article 43, the current half-cent sales tax, is very constrained and does not give us the ability in the foreseeable future of enhancing service. The other thing I'll say, and this is a shameless plug, so I'll admit it when I'm making these plugs. There has been a lot of discussion about the sales tax and what it means for the rail projects. I want to go on record, and I'll do this everywhere I can. We want rapid transit solutions in the corridors, whether that's rail or bus rapid transit. But I want to emphasize the backbone of every transit system, Charlotte included, is bus. And the funding levels that the new revenues would bring in would enable us to significantly enhance bus local service, to be able to execute on what we call Better Bus, which really is a focus on enhancing local service. Also being able to more quickly roll out things like microtransit, to also be able to reinvest in the Charlotte Transit Center, in mobility hubs, in all of these things that are critically important for us to create an enhanced bus service. And I want to underscore that while there, and I understand why, there has been a lot of discussion about rail and BRT. What I think is being lost in this discussion is the utmost importance of bus to transit, because it is the backbone, and what the new sales tax revenues mean for enhancements in bus.
Thank you.
From another way, and you touched on stabilization efforts. So if you look at our revenue stream, the stabilization efforts that have been in place, and we've talked about many of them here today, from buying new equipment to maintenance to staffing, that was the aid into the capacity that we would have potentially had to do any type of expansion. And so that's where we are. It's just we're physically constrained with what we have now, but we've used those monies to stabilize and ensure that what we have is at the best that it can be.
Mr. Cagle, concerning the legislation and the authority component, the new authority that would be created to manage our transit here in Charlotte and potentially in the region as well. There was a plan put forth for various positions, I think 27 members on that authority. Is that carved in stone, or is that something that could be massaged down the line to better suit it for our needs? I know that 27 is a large number of people. You expand it within the region, are we going to have an authority of 30 to 35 or 40 people trying to run transit? It seems like that might be a little bit unwieldy. So that's the question I have, as to whether there's any chance for amending that or changing that to better serve it.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I'll say it this way, I'm probably not the expert on sort of all of the decisions that went into the draft legislation, but it is my impression that the authority board and its makeup in the legislation was thought out and agreed upon by all of the towns, all of the different towns, city of Charlotte, the county. And I believe that is I believe that it's a set number, and I don't believe that it would change. And then to your question of could it be modified in the future? I suppose the answer is yes, but that would be only through a modification of state statute, right? Once the legislation is passed, any modification from that board would require a modification to state statute or action by the General Assembly. And so I do not believe that, I would not anticipate that board, 27 members as envisioned today in the draft legislation, would change.
A couple of other questions. I don't think you mentioned these in your report, Mr. Cagle, but I was interested in if there was any updates on Gateway Station. And I know that there's also an FRA high-speed rail corridor study, which involves Charlotte to Atlanta, which is getting underway. It will have some implications concerning Gateway and possibly an airport station for that service. Do you have any information as to how all of that might work with what's going on?
Yeah, on Gateway Station, we continue working with the Gateway development team and NCDOT/Amtrak, NCDOT representing, in effect, Amtrak. That project, again, we continue working with them on design, and it continues to move forward, and we continue to have good conversations. So more to come on that, or the project continues to move. Related to high-speed rail, I don't really have an update on that other than to say there is the ability of Gateway Station to accommodate high-speed rail. That there's planning going into it that would allow or accommodate high-speed rail if it were built to Charlotte to come into the Gateway Station.
Along those same lines, is there any provision of potential platform space or future platform space for additional commuter rail lines out to the counties, like say Gaston or something like that, should such an opportunity ever avail itself? Is the Gateway Station planned such that it could accommodate that?
Well, let me say it this way. I guess it's not, the Gateway Station is not being designed with additional commuter rail platforms in mind, but that does not preclude us from looking at that in the future if additional commuter rail lines were to be evaluated. I mean, what we'd have to do is look at how to connect into those and how those different rail networks and lines would be able to accommodate that. And so I won't say yes, but I won't say that it's impossible either. We just need to evaluate that as those potential, new commuter rail lines developed, if they developed.
Okay, thank you. I was more concerned about space specifically, just ensuring that space is there in case such opportunities were to come about, rather than wondering if it was provisioned in the current design. My fear is apartment complexes creeping up, right up to the edge of Gateway Station, and then you have no space to build additional capacity.
Yeah, I think we'd have to evaluate that. The other thing to remember, Gateway Station, I know we talk a lot about the O line. Gateway Station is not technically on the O line. It is on the Norfolk Southern main line. And so when we did the transaction with Norfolk Southern for the O line, this is a really in the weeds thing, but it came up. So we also negotiated a use agreement with Norfolk Southern to be able to, in effect, bring commuter rail from the O line onto the Norfolk Southern main line and on into Gateway Station, because technically Gateway Station is on the Norfolk Southern main line, not the O line.
Also, I'd like to add that when NCDOT built the new platforms for Gateway Station, I think they had contemplated that those are for Amtrak use initially, but those could be used for other commuter trains, other Amtrak trains that might be started. Even perhaps high-speed rail might be able to stop at those particular platforms. There are 2 tracks. I think they have an allowance of another 3rd track they could build there if they need it.
That is, you are 100% correct. That is correct.
Okay. I think that pretty much, Mr. Cagle, do you have any more for your report?
No, sir.
Okay. Do we have any more questions around the room? I think we've covered a lot today. So, well, with no other questions around the room, that brings us to other business. So does anyone else have any other business that they'd like to bring before the group before we close out? All righty, hearing none, that brings us to the last agenda item, which is adjournment. So can I get a motion to adjourn, please? All right. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please speak now or forever hold your peace. And the ayes have it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.